Today we're going to be talking about anatomical terms, which are the basic vocabulary words that you're going to need to use to study anatomy this year. We'll be using these words in class as well as in dissections to refer to different areas or parts of the body. The first term we're going to look at today is anatomical position, and this is considered to be the position that we're going to use for reference. Anytime we discuss the location of an organ, we'll be assuming that the human is in standard anatomical position. So we will use this position as the default position for all of the following terms. This is an example of a person that is standing in standard anatomical position. Notice that the person is standing straight upright, facing forward, with the feet flat on the ground. The arms need to be at the side, and most importantly, the palms need to be facing forward. That puts all of the areas of the arm in the correct position for reference. So this is standard anatomical position. The next term we need to look at are the groups of general body regions and many of the adjectives that are associated with these body regions. These are also illustrated in figure 1.4 in your text. Many of the general body regions are pretty basic and are things that we use in everyday language. For example, we all know what the head would be. We know what the neck area is. We know the trunk then to be the chest, the abdomen, and the pelvis. The upper limbs refer to the arms, and then the lower limbs refer to the legs. Now, as I said, these are pretty basic terms. We use them in everyday language. There are a lot of additional, more specific adjectives that go along with these terms. For example, cephalic refers to the neck as well. These adjectives are all in your textbook, and you will need to know the more specific adjectives for the quiz. We have many directional terms that we can use to indicate direction or location according to the standard anatomical position. These include the pairs such as superior and inferior. So superior would refer to upper, as in the head is superior to the chest. Inferior refers to lower, as in the legs are inferior to the chest. The next pair of terms are medial and lateral. Medial refers to the middle or near the midline, and lateral would be to the side or farther from the midline. An example of this would be the nose is medial in respect to the ears, or the arms are lateral in respect to the belly button. The next set of terms are proximal and distal. These only refer to limbs, so we would only be using these on the arms or the legs. And when we're talking about proximal and distal, we're essentially talking about close and further from the point of attachment. So for the upper limbs, we'd be referring to close or far from the shoulder, and for the legs, we'd be looking at close or far from the hip. For example, the knee is proximal with respect to the ankle, or the wrist is distal in respect to the bicep. The last two terms are superficial and deep. Superficial refers to the surface, and deep would be away from the surface. For example, the skin is superficial, but the bone is deep. The next set of terms that we're going to look at are the planes and sections of the body, and these are illustrated in figure 1.6 of your book. These would be used to dissect or to cut a specimen into pieces, either a whole organism or perhaps just a single organ. These are essentially what we would consider to be imaginary flat surfaces that pass through the body. The first one is called the sagittal plane. It is an up and down plane. It is a vertical plane. It's going to divide your body into a left and right side. Okay, so if you were going to cut right down the middle of your nose, between your chest down through your belly button, that would be a sagittal plane. It can be mid-sagittal, that would be directly down the middle, or it could be parasagittal, which would be off to the side. The next plane is called the frontal plane. This is also a vertical plane. This plane is going to cut you into a front half and a back half. Keep in mind that another term for front would be anterior, and another term for back would be posterior. An additional set of terms that mean the same thing for front would be ventral, and for back would be dorsal. A third plane is called the transverse plane. This one is horizontal. This one is going to cut you into a top or superior and a bottom or inferior half. Finally, we can also cut things on an oblique plane, which would be on an angle. This will be very rarely used in anatomy. These pictures are all showing how these planes would address a whole human body. We can look at these same planes and how they would be used to dissect an organ. So here we have a brain, and here we can see several different cuts that one might make to the brain. Up at the top here, we see a frontal section. We see a mid-sagittal section that's cutting right down the middle. We see a horizontal or transverse section, and then at the very bottom there you also see a transverse section of only the spinal cord. So these planes can be used to cut during dissection as well. The next set of terms we're going to look at are the main body cavities in the human body, and we're going to be looking at 4 main cavities, and you'll be practicing these in your open lab activity. The first main cavity is the cranial cavity. You can see that it is kind of an orangish color here, and it includes the skull and the brain. Next, we have the vertebral cavity. That includes the vertebrae and the spinal cord. Notice that the vertebral cavity is inferior to the cranial cavity, and notice also that it is dorsal in reference to the body. The next 2 main body cavities are the thoracic cavity. This would be what we would call the chest. It includes several parts. We have the pleural cavity, which includes the lungs, the pericardial cavity, which includes the heart. This is kind of our first introduction to that root cardi, which means heart. And then we also have the mediastinum, which would be the area between the pleural cavity and the pericardial cavity. Notice in the picture below that the pleural cavity is green, pericardial cavity red, and the mediastinum between them would be kind of like a yellowish color. There's the thoracic cavity in the image. One other thing to point out here is now we would be reaching the area called the diaphragm. This is a flat muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from what we see below, which is called the abdominal pelvic cavity. All of the organs that we see inside the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic cavity together are known as viscera. So we also sometimes talk about visceral as being kind of a gut response. So that's where that term comes from. Last, we have the abdominal pelvic cavity, which is seen in this picture as kind of red and pink. It includes 2 regions, the abdominal cavity, which would be the stomach, spleen, liver, many of those organs, digestive. And then the pelvic cavity below, which is pink. It includes bladder, large intestine, and the reproductive organs. We can take the abdominal pelvic cavity and divide it into smaller regions because there are so many organs that are found here. Your textbook shows this in figure 110. There are 9 regions and also 4 quadrants. So there again is the abdominal pelvic cavity. And here are the more complicated 9 regions or 4 quadrants. When we are looking at the regions and you look at each term, they do give you some information as to where they're found. For example, the white hypochondriac region is below the ribs. That gets its name because chondri is a word for cartilage, and we have some cartilage there in between the ribs. Epigastric is the upper gastric or upper digestive area. The umbilical region would be where your umbilical cord would be, about where your belly button would be. Hypogastric is below the digestive system or the lower digestive system. We also see right and left lumbar regions. Lumbar would be referring to the lower back region of your vertebrae. And then we have right and left iliac region, which is getting its name from the fact that it is below the hip, and the hip bone is the ilium.